The wind howled like a living beast, tearing across the frozen plains. Snow swirled in wild, blinding spirals, hiding the horizon, hiding the mountains, hiding the sun on the planet of Norvain. Storms like this were feared more than any predator. They called them sky eaters because when they came, they swallowed the world in white. Lyra ran, her breath sharp and painful in her chest. The air was so cold, it felt like it was cutting her lungs. Her boots sank into deep snow, her legs burning around her. The village was in chaos, doors slamming, shutters locking, people vanishing inside their homes. But she wasn't running for safety. She was running for her child, Ryan. She screamed, her voice ripped apart by the wind, somewhere out there in the deadly white. Her little boy was lost. He had been playing near the edge of the village when the storm struck without warning. One moment the sky had been clear, the next it had turned black and furious. No one survived outside in a sky eater. But Lyra's heart didn't care about rules, only about finding her son. Snow clung to her eyelashes, freezing her tears before they could fall. The wind shoved her sideways, almost throwing her into the snow. She kept moving, stumbling forward, her eyes searching for any sign of him. Her skin burned from the cold, her fingers already going numb inside her gloves. She didn't notice the figure watching her from the edge of the supply barn. Ethan had been carrying fuel containers when he saw her. He was new to this world, a human from far away. The villagers didn't trust him. They said humans brought trouble. But trouble was already here. He could see it in the way she moved. In the desperation in her voice, she was searching for someone. He dropped the containers and pushed through the snow toward her. Lyra, he shouted, though he wasn't sure. She'd hear, her head turned, eyes wide with fear. She didn't slow down, didn't ask for help. I have to find him, she cried, her voice breaking. Ethan didn't ask who. He just followed. The snow grew thicker, each step heavier than the last. Ethan could barely see her through the blizzard. The wind screamed in his ears, and every gust threatened to throw him off his feet. His cheeks burned, his lips were numb. He knew the stories about the sky eaters, how they froze a person solid in minutes. But he also knew he couldn't let her search alone. Which way? He shouted, moving up beside her. She pointed ahead, toward the endless white. Somewhere in that direction, the storm had swallowed a small, frightened boy. They pressed on, leaning into the wind. Snowflakes stung their faces like needles. It was hard to tell if they were even walking in a straight line. Then, through the roar of the wind, a sound reached them, faint, small, but there. It was a cry, weak and muffled. Lyra's eyes went wide. Ryan? She shouted, almost sobbing. Ethan grabbed her arm before she could run blindly toward the sound. Slow, we have to move together, he yelled. They pushed forward, following the noise, every second feeling like it was slipping away from Lol. The cry came again. Closer this time, Ethan dropped to his knees. Sweeping his hands through the snow, his gloves hit something soft fabric. He dug faster, the snow biting into his wrists. A small shape appeared, curled up, barely moving. The boy's face was pale, his lips blue. Lyra fell beside him, pulling him into her arms. She pressed her cheek against his, whispering his name over and over. But the wind didn't care. The storm didn't care. It wanted to take all three of them. Ethan crouched low, shielding them both from the wind. We can't stay here, he shouted. Lyra's tears froze against her skin as she nodded. Ethan pulled off his thick outer coat and wrapped it around the boy. The cold cut into him immediately, but he ignored it. They had to move. He looked over his shoulder, but the village was already gone from sight, swallowed by the storm. The only way back was to fight through the blizzard. He didn't know if they would make it, but he knew this. He wasn't going to stop until that boy was safe. The storm roared louder, as if angry they had found him. The snow swirled thicker, the wind stronger. Still, Ethan pushed forward. One arm around Lyra to keep her steady, the other holding the boy close to his chest. With every step, the cold tried to slow them. Tried to freeze them in place, but they kept going, because in this storm, stopping meant dying. Asterisk, the sound was so faint it almost vanished into the howl of the wind. But Ethan's ears caught it again, a small, broken cry. It was the sound of someone too cold to scream any louder. Lyra's head jerked toward the noise, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "Ryan?" she cried, though her voice was barely louder than the storm. Ethan tightened his grip on her arm. "Stay with me. If you run alone, you'll get lost," he shouted. She nodded quickly, her body trembling not only from the cold, but from the awe. Fear of being too late, they moved together, their boots sinking deep into the snow. Each step a battle. The wind was merciless, pushing against them like a living wall. The cry came again, closer this time. Ethan dropped to his knees without warning and began digging with his gloved hands. Snow poured over his arms as he clawed through it. His fingers struck something soft. A bundle of cloth. He dug faster, his breath ragged. Then the small face of a boy appeared, eyes half closed, lips dark blue. Lyra fell to her knees beside Ethan. Her hands shook as she lifted the boy into her arms. "Ryan, Ryan, stay with me," she whispered. Her voice breaking, the child made a faint sound, a shallow breath. Ethan ripped open his coat and pulled the boy against his chest. The human's body heat was warmer than anything the boy had felt in the last deadly minutes. The cold gnawed at Ethan immediately. He ignored it, wrapping his coat tight around the boy's small frame. Lyra tried to shield them with her own body, crouching low as the wind howled over their heads. But the storm wasn't letting them go. It threw snow in their faces, pushed them back. The white darkness made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Ethan knew they couldn't make it all the way to the village in this weather. The child was too weak. Lyra was slowing down. He leaned close to her ear, shouting, "There's an old research hut near here, half a mile, maybe less." She looked doubtful. "It's dangerous to stay out here," she said. "It's death to keep moving without shelter," he replied. Lyra's grip tightened on her son. Her instincts screamed to run for the village, but the human's voice had a sharp truth in it. If they kept walking in the open, the storm would. When, finally, she nodded, Ethan shifted the boy's weight in his arms and started forward. Every step was heavy, the snow swallowing their legs. The wind screamed like it was trying to drive them into the ground. The hut appeared out of nowhere, a black shape in the endless white. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and one wall was cracked, but it was standing, and that was enough. Ethan kicked the door hard, and it swung inward with a groan. They stumbled inside, the sudden stillness shocking after the chaos outside. The air was freezing, but without the wind, it felt almost bearable. Ethan lowered the boy onto a dusty cot. Lyra knelt beside her child, holding his cold hands between hers. The boy's eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. Ethan searched the shelves and found a small sealed metal pack, an old emergency heat cell. He cracked it open, and it began to warm slowly. He slid it under the blanket covering the boy. Lyra's eyes shone with tears. You saved him," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "We're not safe yet. The storm will last for hours." The hut creaked in the wind. The sound was unsettling. Like the storm was testing the walls, Ethan glanced at the corner, where a broken window was covered with ice. If that gave way, the cold would pour in like water through a broken dam. Lyra's voice was trembling. "Why are you helping us?" "The others." "They wouldn't." Ethan met her gaze, his breath misting in the cold air. "Because he's just a child. No storm, no rule, no border should decide if he lives or dies." For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the wind filled the silence. Pressing against the hut like a giant hand, Ethan checked the boy's breathing again. It was a little stronger now, but still slow. We'll stay until the worst passes. Then take the canyon route. It's shorter, but risky, he said. Lyra frowned. The canyon is unstable. Ice falls without warning. Ethan gave a small, grim smile. Then we'll just have to be faster than the ice. Outside, the storm roared on, but inside the hut, for the first time since the nightmare began, there was a fragile thread of hope. The human sat close to the alien mother and child. Keeping his coat wrapped tightly around the boy, every few seconds, he would glance at the door, ready to face the storm again when the time came, because no matter how dangerous the path ahead was, he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let the white darkness win. The hut groaned under the weight of the storm. Snow piled against its cracked walls, whispering through the gaps like the hiss of something alive. Inside, the air was bitter cold, but without the wind, it felt like a small victory. Ethan knelt beside the boy, checking his breathing. Ryan's chest moved slowly. But it moved. That was enough to keep going. Lyra sat on the edge of the cot, holding her son's small hand. Her fingers were shaking, but she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or the fear. She looked around the hut. Dust clung to every surface. Cobwebs hung from the corners. The place smelled of rust and old metal. It was abandoned long before she was born. Everyone in the village thought the storms had destroyed it years ago, yet here it was, still standing like a ghost from another time. Ethan rose and moved toward the storage shelves. Most of what he touched crumbled under his fingers. Empty cans, cracked containers, useless scraps. Then, tucked behind a broken heater, he found an emergency ration kit. The seal was broken, but inside were 2 heat packs and a flask. The packs could buy them time, maybe enough to get through the canyon later. He activated one and slid it under the boy's blanket. Lyra's eyes followed every move he made. "You know this place well?" she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. "I studied the maps before I came here. I'd like to know where to run if things go bad." Lyra looked back at her son. "Things went bad," she whispered, her voice catching. The hut rattled as a strong gust slammed against it. The sound was deep and heavy, like a giant fist pounding on the walls. A crack of snow fell from the roof into the corner, sending a shiver down Lyra's spine. "How long can it hold?" she asked. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Long enough, I hope, but we can't stay through the night." She met his gaze. Reading the truth there, this was only a pause, not safety. The wind howled outside, throwing icy sand against the walls. Every now and then, a sharp pop echoed through the boards. Lyra held Ryan tighter, as if afraid the storm might reach in and snatch him away. Ethan sat by the door, his back to the wood. The handle rattled from the pressure of the wind outside. He thought about the canyon. It was shorter than the open plains, but it was also a trap. Ice hung overhead like teeth, waiting to fall still. The longer they waited here, the colder the boy would get, and in the open, the village was too far to reach before the storm froze them solid. He pulled a map from his pocket, spreading it on the floor between them. "This is where we are," he said, pointing to a small dot. "This line here, the canyon path, it cuts the distance in half." Lyra frowned, tracing the route with her eyes. "My people avoid it during storms. The walls collapse." Ethan nodded. "I've walked worse. We move fast, we keep to the middle, and we don't stop for anything." Lyra's gaze dropped to her son. The thought of moving him through such danger made her chest ache, but leaving him in the hut until the storm passed might mean there'd be nothing left of him to save. Her voice was low. "If we go, and the ice falls." Ethan's voice was firm. "If we don't go, the cold will finish what the storm started." Silence hung between them for a moment, broken only by the low whistle of wind finding its way through the cracks. Then Lyra nodded once, sharply. "We go." Ethan stood. Pulling his coat tighter, he checked the flask from the ration kit, still sealed. Still drinkable, he handed it to Lyra. small sips. For him first, she lifted it to her son's lips. Letting a few drops touch his tongue, Ryan stirred. Faintly, a tiny sound escaping him. It was enough to make her eyes shine with fresh tears. Ethan began packing what little they could take. 1 heat pack, the flask, and the map. The rest was either broken or too heavy to carry. The wind outside roared again, making the walls shiver. It was as if the storm sensed their plan and wanted to crush it before it began. He moved to the door and tested it against the wind. It pushed back like a living thing. He glanced at Lyra. "When I open this, don't stop moving. We keep to my steps, no matter what you hear or see." Lyra tightened her hold on her son. "I'll follow." Ethan took a deep breath. The hut had given them a small pocket of hope in the endless white, but now they had to step out into the storm again, and this time the path ahead would be narrower, darker, and deadlier. He pulled the door open, and the storm screamed into the hut like it had been waiting for them. Snow swirled inside, biting at their faces. Ethan stepped out first, leaning into the wind. Behind him, Lyra followed, clutching Ryan close. The hut door slammed shut behind them, and the shelter that shouldn't exist faded back into the storm's white jaws. The canyon rose before them like the mouth of a giant beast. Its walls were high and jagged, coated with thick ice that glistened faintly even in the storm's dim light. The narrow path ahead was dark, the kind of dark that made you feel like something was waiting inside. Ethan paused for a moment, scanning the cliff edges. Above them, icicles hung like knives, some as long as a man, swaying slightly in the wind. "This way," he said, his voice low but firm. Lyra adjusted her hold on Ryan, keeping him close against her chest under the layers of coats. The boy's breathing was still shallow, but she could feel some warmth returning to him. The wind funneled through the canyon, turning into a deep, howling echo. It sounded almost alive, like the canyon itself was warning them to leave. Ethan stepped onto the icy ground, moving carefully. His boots crunched in the thin layer of snow over the ice. "Keep to my steps. The middle is safer." He called back. Lyra nodded and followed, her eyes darting to the cliffs above. The storm's roar was softer here, but every sound seemed sharper. The faint crack of shifting ice made her heart jump. Halfway into the canyon, a gust of wind funneled through, carrying fine snow that stung their skin. Ethan kept his body angled forward, shielding Ryan as much as possible. The walls on both sides loomed close now, their icy surfaces reflecting the pale light. It felt like walking through the ribs of some ancient frozen creature. A sharp sound rang out, crack. High above them, Ethan's head snapped upward. A long, thin shard of ice had broken free, tumbling down toward them. "Move," he shouted, pushing Lyra forward. The shard shattered on the ground where they had been seconds before, spraying them with sharp, cold fragments. Lyra's breath came fast, her heart pounding. She had heard stories of travelers being buried under sudden ice falls. She never imagined she would be one of them. Ethan glanced at her, his face calm but eyes alert. "We can't stop," he said. She swallowed and nodded, tightening her grip. On Ryan, the path narrowed further ahead, forcing them almost single file. The ice overhead formed arches that looked ready to collapse. Ethan's boots slid slightly on a hidden patch of smooth ice. He steadied himself, then reached back to guide Lyra across the same spot. Her foot slipped, but his hand caught her wrist instantly. For a brief second, they locked eyes, a silent promise that he wouldn't let her fall. They moved deeper, the light fading as the canyon curved. Snow swirled above, but didn't fully reach them here. Instead, the air grew colder and heavier. Ethan knew that meant the storm's winds were building on the far side. They would have to push through it when they emerged. Another loud crack echoed from above, this one deeper, heavier. Ethan looked up just in time to see a massive block. Of ice shifting loose, it was too big to avoid completely. "Run!" he barked. They sprinted forward, their boots slipping on the icy ground. The ice came crashing down behind them with a roar, splintering into jagged pieces that bounced across the canyon floor. A shard grazed Ethan's shoulder, tearing his coat and leaving a thin line of blood. He didn't even slow down. They stopped only when they reached a wider section where the walls were farther apart. Ethan leaned against the ice wall, catching his breath. Lyra knelt to check Ryan. His small eyes were still closed, but his lips had lost some of their terrible blue color. She brushed the boy's hair back, whispering softly. Ethan watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze ahead. They were halfway through, but the most dangerous part, the canyon's exit, still lay ahead. The wind's howl grew louder. The further they walked, it pushed at them in bursts, sometimes forcing them to brace themselves to avoid falling. Ethan led without hesitation, his steps sure despite the ice beneath them. Lyra followed closely, every nerve alert to the sound of shifting ice. At last, the faint light ahead began to grow brighter. "That's the exit," Ethan said, pointing, but as they drew closer, a sudden, deep groan echoed through the canyon. Lyra froze. The sound was followed by a long, tearing crack. Ethan didn't even look up. He grabbed her arm and pulled. "Don't stop if you stop. We don't make it." They burst out of the canyon into the blizzard's full force again. Snow whipped against their faces, stealing their breath. Ethan adjusted his coat around Ryan and started toward the faint shadow of the village walls in the distance. The hardest part of the canyon was behind them, but the storm still had one last challenge before they could reach safety. The village walls rose from the snow like the sides of a great fortress to Ethan. They looked close enough to touch, but every step through the storm felt endless. The wind hit them with the force of a wave, shoving them sideways. Lyra's arms tightened around Ryan as she leaned into the gale. Ethan kept one arm around her to steady her and the other holding the boy against his chest. Finally, they reached the great wooden gates. They were shut tight, the thick planks reinforced with metal. Ethan pounded on them with his fist, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Open up. We have a child. He's freezing." The only answer was the storm. Then, through the blizzard, a small sliding hatch in the gate scraped open. A pair of alien eyes peered out at them. It was one of the village guards, his face hidden behind a fur-lined mask. "You know the rules." The guard's voice was muffled but hard. "During a Sky Eater, the gates stay shut until it passes." Ethan stepped closer, snow whipping around him. "If you leave us out here, he'll die," he said, motioning to the boy in his arms. The guard's eyes flicked to Ryan, but his voice didn't soften. "I'm sorry, the wind will rip the gates from the walls if we open them now." Lyra's voice broke as she called out, "Please, he's my son. He's burning with cold. Please let us in." Another guard joined the first, peering through the hatch. They exchanged a look, but the answer was the same. "It's not safe for you or for us." Ethan's jaw clenched. The storm screamed around them, snow piling at their feet. He took one slow step forward until his face was almost at the hatch. "You'll explain to his ghost why you didn't open the gate," he said, his voice low but sharp. The guard hesitated. "We have to follow orders." The boy stirred weakly in Ethan's arms, letting out a faint, broken cough. That sound hit Ethan like a blade without thinking. He shoved Ryan gently into the guard's arms through the hatch. The man stiffened in surprise. "Hold him," Ethan ordered. "Feel how cold he is, then tell me you'll leave him here." The guard's hands trembled as he felt the child's icy skin through the blankets. His eyes flicked to Lyra, who stood with her arms empty now, her face pale with fear. Behind them, the wind screamed like it wanted to tear all three of them apart. Finally, the guard swore under his breath and called over his shoulder, "Open the gate now." There was a shout from inside, then the sound of heavy locks being pulled. The great doors groaned and shifted, just enough for them to slip inside the moment they crossed the threshold. Warmth hit them like a wave, not from the air, but from the absence of the storm. The gates slammed shut behind them, sealing away the roar of the blizzard. Villagers gathered, staring at the human, the alien mother, and the child. Some whispered to each other. Others looked at Ethan with suspicion. Humans were rare here, and not all were welcome. But right now, all eyes were on the boy in the guard's arms. Lyra rushed forward and took her son back, cradling him close. Tears rolled down her cheeks. This time warm enough to fall instead of freeze. "He's still breathing," she whispered. Ethan stood nearby, his breath coming in slow. Heavy clouds, snow dripped from his hair and coat. Pulling at his boots, he didn't ask for thanks. He just needed to know the boy was alive. One of the healers came forward. "This way, quickly," she said, leading Lyra toward the healing hall. Lyra looked back once, meeting Ethan's eyes. There was no smile, no words, only a silent connection born from surviving the storm together. Then she vanished inside. Ethan remained in the courtyard. Leaning against the wall, the guard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. He could still hear the storm's rage beyond the gates. Inside, there was safety, but he didn't feel safe yet. Not until he saw the boy's eyes open. The healing hall smelled faintly of herbs and warm steam inside. The air was much softer than the freezing storm outside. Lyra sat beside the cot where Ryan lay, wrapped in thick blankets. His small chest rose and fell slowly, each breath a little steadier. Then the last. The healer moved quietly around them, checking his temperature and murmuring words Lyra barely heard. Ethan didn't come inside. He stayed just beyond the doorway, his back against the cold stone wall of the courtyard. Snow still clung to his coat and hair, melting slowly into dark. Patches his hands were red from the cold, the skin raw from digging in the snow. But he didn't move toward the fire or the warmth. He watched the door to the healing hall like a soldier guarding a gate. The storm outside the village walls roared. Like a living creature, it battered the gates, rattled the rooftops, and sent icy gusts through the narrow streets. Villagers passed by, glancing at Ethan. Some looked curious, some wary. To them, a human standing alone in the snow was a strange sight, especially one who had risked himself for someone who wasn't his own. Inside the hall, Lyra held Ryan's hand. Her thumb brushed gently over his small fingers, feeling the faint but growing warmth. Her heart was still pounding from the memory of the storm. If Ethan hadn't been there. She didn't finish the thought. She stood, her knees a little weak, and walked to the doorway. Ethan straightened slightly when he saw her. "He'll live," she said, her voice soft but sure, for the first time since the storm began. Ethan let out a long breath. His shoulders dropped, and the tension in his face eased just a little. "You should be in there with him," he said. Lyra shook her head. "You're out here freezing. You've saved him. And you stand outside like you did nothing." Ethan glanced toward the firelight, spilling from the doorway. "I don't need thanks," he replied. "I just needed to make sure he was safe." Lyra studied him for a moment, her eyes catching on the tear in his coat where the canyon ice had cut him. "You're hurt," she said. Stepping closer, Ethan shrugged. "It's nothing, I've had worse." But she didn't believe him. Her people were taught to fear humans, to see them as dangerous, selfish, unpredictable. Yet this man had carried her son through a storm, shielded him from falling ice, and faced down the village guards without a second thought. And now he stood here, shivering in the eye, cold, refusing to take the warmth for himself until he knew they were safe. One of the guards approached slowly. His eyes didn't meet Ethan's eye. "Was wrong," the guard said, his voice low. Ethan said nothing. The man shifted uncomfortably. "The elders will want to speak to you." Ethan gave a small, humorless smile. They'll want to know why a human broke their rules. The guard hesitated, then nodded. They'll also want to know why you didn't let that boy die. Ethan's gaze hardened slightly. Because I don't care whose rules they are. A child is worth breaking them. Lyra heard the words and felt a warmth spread in her chest. She stepped between Ethan and the cold wind, as if her small frame could shield him from it. You should come inside, she said. Ethan shook his head. Later, for now, you stay with him. Her eyes softened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached out and took his hand briefly. Her fingers were warm against his cold skin. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for the rescue, but for everything, the healer called from inside. Lyra, he's asking for you. She gave Ethan one last look before hurrying back to her son. Ethan watched her go, then turned his gaze upward. Snow was still falling, thick and endless. But for the first time since he arrived on this frozen world, it didn't feel quite so heavy. He stayed outside until the hall's door opened again. Lyra stood there, holding Ryan's hand. The boy's eyes were half open now, sleepy but alive. When he saw Ethan, he managed a faint, tired smile. In that moment, the cold around Ethan didn't matter at all. The storm passed in the night, leaving the village wrapped in a blanket of white. The air was still sharp and cold, but the sky above was clear for the first time in days. Sunlight bounced off the snow, filling the streets with a pale glow from Dick's. The healing hall, the sound of footsteps echoed as Lyra walked out. Her son was in her arms, his cheeks no longer pale, his eyes open and curious. Ethan was already awake, standing in the courtyard near the gates. He had slept little, choosing instead to walk the wall and help the guards clear the snow. When he saw them, he stopped, the cold air puffing around him in slow breaths. Ryan looked at him for a long moment before reaching out a small hand. It was an invitation without words. Lyra carried her son closer, stopping just in front of Ethan. "This is the man who saved you," she said softly to the boy, Ryan's. Fingers curled around Ethan's glove. The human crouched slightly so he was eye level with the child. "You're stronger than the storm," Ethan told him with a faint smile. The boy didn't answer, but his grip tightened, and he didn't. Let go, villagers began to gather, their whispers rising like wind through dry grass. Some looked curious, others wary. A few nodded in silent respect. It was rare for anyone to challenge the storm, rarer still for a human to defy the village's strict laws. Yet here stood one, not asking for praise, only standing as if ready to leave when told. The elders appeared from the meeting hall, their robes heavy with fur. They walked slowly, their expressions unreadable. When they stopped in front of Ethan, the courtyard fell silent. The oldest among them spoke first, his voice deep. "You broke our rule," he said. Ethan didn't deny it. "I did," he replied, "because the rule would have killed a child." There was a pause, the kind that seemed to stretch forever. Then the elder looked down at Ryan, still holding Ethan's hand. "You risked yourself for one of ours," the elder said. "Yes," Ethan answered simply. The elder's gaze shifted to the people gathered around. "Perhaps we were too quick to judge," he said, his tone softer now from within his robe. The elder pulled out a long woven scarf, silver threads running through it. It was the symbol of warm bond, the highest sign of gratitude their people could give. He placed it around Ethan's neck. "This means you are welcome here," the elder said. The crowd murmured, some in surprise, others in approval. For the first time since arriving on this world, Ethan felt the weight of suspicion around him lighten. Lyra stood a little taller beside him, her son nestled in her arms. "You didn't just save my child," she said quietly so only Ethan could hear. "You showed them that humans can have warm hearts, even in the coldest places." Ethan glanced at her. a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Storms pass," he said, "but kindness stays." Children crept closer. Curious about the human, one tugged on his coat. Another asked about the ice canyon. Ethan answered with short, simple words, not turning the story into something grand. To him, it had only been the right thing to do, but to them, was a story they would carry through many winters. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows on the snow. The gates of the village were opened a little to let the wind carry away the last of the drifting snow piles. Ethan stood near the entrance, the silver scarf warm against his neck. Ryan wiggled in his mother's arms until she set him down. The boy walked over to Ethan, looked up, and simply said, "You're warm." Ethan's chest tightened at the words. He knelt down and put a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "So are you," he said. Lyra smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. Around them, the villagers began to move on with their day. But something had changed. The air between them was no longer filled with suspicion. It was filled with something rare on a world of endless ice, trust, and as the cold wind swept across the plains beyond the walls, Ethan knew this frozen place no longer felt quite so far from home.